Alright, here we go. Number 10. The Iron Cage. In 1536, the city of Münster witnessed something that was designed never to be forgotten. 3 iron cages were hoisted to the steeple of St. Lambert's church, each one containing the body of an Anabaptist leader. Jan van Leiden, Bernd Knipperdolling, and Bernd Krechting had been tortured to death with red-hot pincers in the market square below, and their remains were locked inside these frames for the city and the world to see. The cages are still there today. What makes this historically disturbing is not the 1536 case itself, which was extensively documented, but everything that came before it. The iron cage as a punishment predates these executions by at least a century. Episcopal records from the Diocese of Münster contain references to cage construction and used well before the Reformation, but the details of who was held inside them, for how long, and what happened to them are almost entirely absent from the surviving archive. The cages measured approximately 1.2 meters in diameter. That is too small to stand, too small to sit upright, too small to lie flat. A person placed inside one could only crouch, exposed to weather, to starvation, to the sustained attention of a public that had been officially encouraged to watch. Death in these conditions took days, sometimes weeks. The systematic absence of records describing the pre-1536 cases is not an oversight. Diocesan authorities were meticulous record keepers in every other domain. The cages were built to be permanent. The records were not. Across the Holy Roman Empire, similar cage punishments appear in fragmentary regional sources, always described in documents of prohibition rather than practice, always mentioned in the context of being curtailed rather than authorized. The pattern is consistent enough to be a policy. The iron frames still hang from St. Lambert's steeple. They have outlasted every record of everyone who died inside them. Whatever happened in those cages before 1536, the church decided the details were not for history to keep. Number 9. The breaking wheel. In 1348, King Philip VI of France issued a royal edict that attempted to regulate the use of the breaking wheel as a method of execution. The edict is a remarkable document, not for what it authorized, but for what it implicitly acknowledged. Regulation requires something pre-existing to regulate. The breaking wheel had been in use across France and the Holy Roman Empire for generations before Philip VI felt compelled to write rules governing it, and the unregulated years left almost no official record at all. The mechanics of the breaking wheel were systematic and deliberately prolonged. The condemned was spread-eagled across a large cartwheel and secured. The executioner then used a heavy iron-rimmed wheel, or a hammer, to shatter the limbs in a prescribed sequence, beginning with the extremities and moving inward toward the torso. The design was specific: keep the person alive and conscious for as long as possible. Death typically took hours, in some documented cases, days. What Philip VI's edict tells us is that before 1348, executioners were applying the wheel without any prescribed sequence or limit. Surviving records from Nuremberg in the 1440s document cases in which executioners were formally reprimanded for deviating from the regulated procedure, which means the unregulated versions were worse, significantly worse. The reprimands exist. The details of what was being reprimanded do not. The breaking wheel was formally abolished in France in 1789 and progressively across the German states in the early 19th century. By then, it had been in regulated use for over 400 years. The regulated version, which courts eventually decided was too barbaric to continue, replaced something that had no written rules, no oversight, and almost no surviving documentation. If the version that was eventually banned by every European nation required 400 years of regulation to reach that point, what exactly was happening in the unregulated centuries before anyone thought to write the rules down? Number 8. Rough music. In the medieval and early modern periods, the most harrowing punishments were not always delivered by the state. Some were delivered by the community itself in rituals that operated entirely outside official sanction. and that left records only when they went wrong enough that authorities could no longer ignore them. Across France, England, and the Low Countries, this practice was known variously as charivari, rough music, or Katzenmusik, and its victims were not criminals in any legal sense. They were people who had violated the unwritten rules of social order. The ritual followed a recognizable pattern. A crowd would gather outside the target's home, typically at night, armed with pots, pans, and improvised instruments. The noise was sustained and deliberate. The crowd would demand the target appear, and appearance was not optional. What followed ranged from enforced public humiliation to sustained physical assault. The target had no legal recourse because no official had ordered the punishment, and no official would acknowledge it had occurred. English ecclesiastical courts attempted to suppress charivari as early as the 14th century, with limited success. Municipal authorities in Flemish cities issued prohibitions throughout the 15th century, each one documenting a practice that previous prohibitions had failed to stop. The council records that survive describe the incidents in careful, bureaucratic language, noting deaths as misadventure, injuries as self-inflicted, and the crowds as spontaneous gatherings rather than organized groups. That language is the tell. When official documents go out of their way to describe a community killing as something other than what it was, the document itself becomes evidence of institutional complicity. Authorities who privately approved of the targets publicly condemned the practice, and the records reflect that negotiation in every careful phrase. The Council of Bruges banned charivari in writing. The practice continued for another 2 centuries. What got banned was the paperwork, not the punishment. Number 7. The hanging gibbet. In 1752, the British Parliament passed the Murder Act, formally authorizing gibbeting as a legal punishment. The act specified that the bodies of executed murderers could be suspended in iron frames at the scene of their crimes, as a deterrent to others. Parliamentary records present this as a considered legal innovation, a new measure appropriate to the severity of murder. It was not new. It was the legalization of something that had been happening without legal sanction for at least 3 centuries. The gibbet frame was a custom-fitted iron cage, constructed to the measurements of the executed body. Surviving blacksmith's accounts from Leicestershire in 1832 record the cost of his gibbet construction at approximately £14, 2 shillings and 6pence. A detailed commercial transaction for something that was, by then, at the end of its official life. The frame was hoisted on a post, often at a crossroads, or at the site of the crime, and left until nothing remained. Fragmentary records from French and English regional archives suggest that in the centuries before 1752, gibbeting was occasionally applied to prisoners who were not yet dead. The documentation is incomplete by design. No magistrate wanted to be formally associated with a practice that had no legal basis, so no formal record was made. The practice existed in the space between official silence and community knowledge, which is exactly where the most inhumane punishments tend to live. James Cook, a murderer from Leicester, was gibbeted in 1832. He is among the last documented cases in England. The Anatomy Act of the same year effectively ended the practice, and formal abolition followed in 1834. The Murder Act of 1752 had given gibbeting 82 years of official existence. If Parliament needed to pass a law authorizing gibbeting in 1752, what were the courts doing with iron frames for the 300 years before anyone wrote it down? Number 6. The whipping post. In 1530, Henry VIII of England passed the Vagabonds Act, mandating that vagrants be tied to a whipping post and beaten until, in the statute's own words, the blood be drawn from their bodies. The language is precise and institutional. It represents one of the first formal codifications of post-punishment in English law, and it was designed to be public, to be witnessed, and to be remembered. What it was not designed to do was record what happened to people who did not survive it. The whipping post was a permanent fixture in most English market towns from at least the 13th century onward. It stood in the market square, visible to everyone because visibility was the point. The punishment was a spectacle, and spectacles require an audience. But the deaths the post caused were not spectacles. They were inconveniences, and the official record treated them accordingly. Deaths from post-punishment were routinely recorded by coroners as illness, as sudden collapse, or as misadventure. The cause was noted. The context was not. Historian A.L. Beyer, in his 1985 study Masterless Men, documents the demonstrable gap between parish burial records and official court records in Elizabethan London. The parish registers of churches in areas with documented post-punishment record deaths that the corresponding coroner's records do not acknowledge. The discrepancy is not accidental. Deaths from post-punishment created legal liability for the administering constable or magistrate. The simplest solution was to record the death without recording its cause. Delaware retained judicial flogging until 1952, making it the last American state to abolish the practice. England formally ended it for most offenses under the Criminal Justice Act of 1948. By the time these legislative abolitions occurred, the post had been in official use for over 6 centuries. The post stood in the market square where everyone could see it. The deaths it caused were recorded in the one place no authority was required to read, the burial register of the local parish church. Number 5. The execution block. In 1535, the execution of Sir Thomas More on Tower Hill was one of the most carefully documented judicial killings in English history. The date, the charges, the witnesses, the exact sequence of events, all of it recorded in detail by multiple sources. More's death entered the historical record completely. But More's execution was exceptional, not because a former Lord Chancellor was beheaded, but because the record was kept at all. For every beheading that entered the official archive, an unknown number did not. Judicial beheading by axe in England was legally reserved for the nobility. The Treason Act of 1351 established the framework, and the class-based logic of execution methods meant that records were more likely to be kept for high-profile cases involving named figures of rank. The Tower of London's own institutional history acknowledges that executions conducted within the walls during the 12th and 13th centuries were carried out without formal record in a significant number of cases. The Tower's archive is not incomplete because documents were lost. It is incomplete because documents were never made. In France, the situation was more complex and more consequential. Under the legal principle of droit de haute justice, feudal lords held the right to execute their own subjects without reporting to any central authority. This right was not abolished until 1670. For several centuries before that date, an unknown number of executions were conducted on private authority, on private land, with private record keeping that in most cases amounted to nothing. The block, the axe, and the body were all within the lord's jurisdiction. So was the decision of whether to write anything down. The last public beheading in England took place in 1747 when Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was executed on Tower Hill. By that point, the historical record of English judicial beheading was already centuries deep and still demonstrably incomplete. French provincial court records from the pre-revolutionary period are estimated by historians to be no more than 30% complete. How many people were executed on the private authority of men who owned the land, owned the block, and owned the only records that might have confirmed it happened? Number 4. Heavy chains and the oubliette. In 1166, Henry II of England issued the Assize of Clarendon, one of the first formal attempts to regulate English criminal procedure. Among its provisions was a requirement that accused felons be held in chains pending trial. The Assize was a legal innovation, an attempt to bring order to a system that had operated without consistent rules. What it did not regulate, and what the historical record almost entirely omits, was the fate of prisoners who were chained and then simply forgotten, held for years without trial, without documentation, and without release. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris, writing in the 13th century, documented prisoners held in foot irons at the Tower of London for periods exceeding 5 years. The Tower's own records for those individuals are absent. They appear in Matthew Paris's account, and nowhere in the official archive, which means they existed in institutional custody without institutional acknowledgement. The word the French used for the cells designed to hold such people was oubliette, from the verb oublier, to forget. The name was not a description of the architecture, it was a description of the administrative policy. Historian Guy Geltner, in his 2008 study, The Medieval Prison, documents the systematic absence of release records across Italian city-state prisons of the same period. Prisoners appear in intake records. They do not appear in release records. The intake was documented because it required authorization. The outcome was not documented because it required none. A prisoner didn't need to be actively condemned to a permanent sentence. They only needed to be chained and then omitted from the paperwork. The Council of Vienne, convened in 1311, issued a papal condemnation of certain chaining practices used against prisoners held without trial. The condemnation itself is the primary evidence that the practices existed. The council didn't describe what it was condemning, it only condemned it, which tells you everything about how these things worked and how they were meant to be remembered. They didn't need to sentence people to die in chains, they only needed to stop writing their names down. The intake record was the last document that proved a person had ever existed. Number 3. Little Ease. Somewhere in the basement of the Tower of London, there is a cell that measures approximately 4 feet in every dimension. It is called Little Ease. You cannot stand in it. You cannot sit upright in it. You cannot lie flat. The only position available to a person placed inside it is a sustained, involuntary crouch, maintained without rest, without relief, and without any means of marking the passage of time. The cell is real. It is still there. And the official record of who was held inside it and for how long begins far later than the physical evidence of the cell suggests it should. The first documentary reference to Little Ease in Tower records connects to the period of the Reformation. John Gerard, a Jesuit priest, recorded his confinement there in 1597 in an account written later in exile, published as the autobiography of an Elizabethan around 1609. Gerard's account is the primary first-person source for what the cell did to a person. He describes the progressive destruction of the body under conditions of enforced immobility, the joints, the muscles, the inability to sleep, the way pain becomes the only consistent reference point when all others are removed. Gerard survived. He escaped the tower in 1597. His survival is precisely why his account exists. The nature of Little Ease and the nature of the record-keeping surrounding it meant that prisoners who did not get out left no account at all. The architectural evidence assessed by the historians of the tower's construction suggests the cell predates its first documentary reference by a significant margin. The stone is older than any surviving record of its use. Similar cells appear in the records of the Château de Vincennes in France and the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. In each case, the pre-16th century documentation is fragmentary to the point of near absence. The Council of Basel, meeting between 1431 and 1449, issued directives against certain forms of imprisonment without trial. The directives do not describe the conditions being prohibited, they prohibit them. That is the consistent pattern across every institution that operated cells of this kind. The Stone of Little Ease is older than any record of its use. Whatever happened inside it before the first document was written, the people who built it had already decided that those events would not be written down. Number 2. The Inquisition's erased records. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, formally authorizing the use of torture by the Inquisition. The bull specified that torture should not cause loss of limb or risk of death. That specification was not a limit, it was a legal boundary designed to make the authorization defensible, and the surviving records of what followed in the next 3 centuries suggest the boundary was treated as a technicality to be managed rather than a line to be observed. The Inquisition was an institution built on paperwork. Confession had to be voluntary to be theologically valid, and voluntary confession had to be documented, witnessed, and archived. Inquisitors carried manuals. The Directorium Inquisitorum, written by Nicolau Aymeric in 1376, contains explicit instructions for the application of the strappado, a method in which the prisoner's wrists were bound behind their back, the body hoisted by rope, and then dropped, stopping short of the floor. The procedure was designed to dislocate the shoulders without breaking the skin, maintaining the theological fiction of non-mutilation. Repeat applications caused permanent disability. The manuals describe this in procedural language as though annotating a clerical task. The Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid holds records of approximately 44,000 Inquisition cases. Historians estimate this represents no more than 20% of actual proceedings. The gap is not the result of poor archival practice. The Inquisition was meticulous. The gap is the result of deliberate destruction carried out by Inquisition authorities in the 15th and 16th centuries of records that the same authorities had been theologically required to keep. Henry Charles Lay, in his 1888 study, A History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages, documents this pattern of internal archive purging in detail. French Inquisition records for the Languedoc region are estimated to survive at less than 10% of their original volume. An institution that destroys its own mandatory records is telling you something. It is telling you that what those records showed was worse than the institutional sin of destroying a sacred archive. That calculation made by the people who ran the Inquisition is more revealing than anything in the documents that survived. They weighed the evidence of what had been done against the evidence of having destroyed God's required record, and they chose destruction. Whatever the documents contained, that was their conclusion about which was the greater sin to leave behind. Number 1, the punishments that were erased by name. In 1401, the English Parliament passed De Heretico Comburendo, the Act for the Burning of Heretics, establishing burning alive at the stake as the legal punishment for relapsed heresy. The Act is a founding document of English religious persecution, and it has been extensively studied. What has been studied far less is what burning was introduced to replace. Buried in the ecclesiastical and municipal records of the 3 centuries preceding this act is fragmentary evidence of punishments so completely removed from the official record that historians have reconstructed them almost entirely from the shape of their absence, from documents that mention abolitions without describing what was being abolished. The Latin phrase in fovem, meaning into the pit, appears in pre-1300 ecclesiastical records from France and England. It describes a punishment, or a category of punishments, involving prolonged confinement in conditions of extreme deprivation, sometimes combined with live burial in various forms. It is mentioned almost exclusively in records of prohibition rather than records of practice. The Third Lateran Council in 1179 issued prohibitions against specific punishments without naming them explicitly. Canonical lawyers of the 13th century, interpreting these prohibitions in their commentaries, understood them to target practices including in fovem, but their descriptions are deliberately vague, hedged, and partial. The pattern is consistent across French, English, and Italian canonical sources spanning 2 centuries. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden, writing around 1201, contains one of the only explicit references to in fovem in an English medieval chronicle. Subsequent manuscript copies of the same chronicle omit the passage. Someone copying that text, at some point after Roger wrote it, made a decision to remove a single paragraph. That decision tells you more about the nature of the punishment than the paragraph itself could have. Henry III of England issued a royal writ in 1219, ordering that a specific punishment previously applied to certain categories of offenders be discontinued. The writ survives. No record of what punishment it discontinued has been found anywhere in the surviving archive. A king issued a formal legal instrument to stop something, and the thing being stopped was considered too sensitive to name in the instrument that stopped it. Historian Edward Peters, in his 1985 study, Torture, documents this pattern of prohibition without description across medieval canonical and royal sources, noting that authorities consistently banned practices they refused to name. The refusal to name is not accidental or bureaucratic. It is the suppression itself built into the language of the document that was supposed to end it. The shift to burning alive was not experienced by contemporary authorities as an escalation. There is evidence in the surrounding sources that burning, for all its deliberate and calculated brutality, was understood in some institutional contexts as a reduction in severity compared to what it replaced. That assessment, made by the same people who ordered burnings, is the most disturbing piece of evidence in this entire historical record. Every document that survives is a document that someone chose not to destroy. The punishments at the top of this list are not the worst things that happened in the medieval period. They are simply the worst things that someone, at the last moment, could not bring themselves to erase entirely. What was successfully erased was, by definition, something worse. We will never know its name. We know only that it had won, and that the people who used it decided, with apparent deliberation and apparent consensus across multiple countries and multiple centuries, that the world should forget. That decision, more than any surviving record of any surviving punishment, is the thing that should keep you awake. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.